Hey art nerds, when it comes to art supplies, I am definitely a completionist. And as we're kind of wrapping up our student grade showdown, unless you guys send me some watercolors you want to see me review, I wanted to hit some of the chain big box stores where you might or might not find art supplies, since that is where most people are going to find their art supplies. I remember being a wee little back getting into comics, and Walmart was the option I had. My family was not going to drive me to Michael's, and we had a Walmart in our town, so that is where I got my art supplies. So I think when I'm doing these kind of big overviews, these sort of big showdowns, it is important to make sure that I hit the big box stores. So that is why I am very excited to unbox and swatch these Mondo Llama watercolors. These were purchased from Target, actually target.com, for around $20. They come in a fairly nice wooden box. These are the first watercolors I've ever seen that come in a watercolor in a wooden box like this. So I'm actually pretty excited about that. I know there are some like nicer ones that do, but this is the first student grade watercolor I've seen come in a wooden box. So that's kind of interesting. And I'm really hoping that these will live up to the art on the box. So what do you guys think? Are the Mondo Llama watercolors worth it? Has Target got a hit on their hands? Or are we gonna have another subpar, boring, poor performing watercolor today? There is only one way to find out, so let's go ahead and unbox and swatch the Mondo Llama watercolors from Target. Hey there, art nerds. I've got another installment of the Student Grade Showdown for you guys. So this box arrived from Target today. Already opened it, went ahead and blacked out my information. And inside, since this is part of the unboxing, is a Mondo Llama watercolor set. Hooray! And this was made possible thanks to the support and generosity of my patrons on Patreon. So if you guys enjoy my reviews, you know what to do. If you can spare an extra $2 a month, it would really help out a lot. You can join me at patreon.com/natosoup. And not only do you get the warm, fuzzy feeling of knowing that you're helping a small artist on YouTube review art supplies truthfully and honestly, but you also get awesome backer exclusives like accesses to the classes that I create, that I teach in public, as well as early access videos and free coloring printables. So if that sounds good to you, what are you waiting for? Come join me on Patreon. And before we dive too far into this, if you want to see what kind of art I've been working on or what's in the works, make sure you follow me on these social networks. So what initially drew me to the Mondo Llama watercolor set is this is the only watercolor set I reviewed so far that comes in a wooden box. And I believe Balmer B pointed this out to me years ago, and I kind of put it on the back burner, partially because I never go to Target anymore. It's just not in my path, and partially because I was taking a bit of a hiatus from the cheaper art supply reviews. But since we're doing the student grade showdown and I want to make sure that I hit some of the big box stores, I've also got something from Walmart to show you. And we've already taken a look at the horrible Artist Loft watercolor set. I figured checking out Target's might not be a bad idea. They do have a few watercolor sets. They all look like that cake style that was very popular a while back, that Artisan makes and that Artist Loft makes. You guys know what I'm talking about. And I decided to totally avoid those because I've had experiences with those in the past and I've never encountered a good one. I think the best one I've reviewed is the Angora set, and I reviewed that over on the blog years ago. And even that wasn't that great. It was still very chalky. So in, the hopes of fairness and not just totally wasting my money and the money of my patrons, I went with the set that looked like it might possibly be promising. Now, before we dive in, I want to set expectations. I don't think this set is going to be particularly great. I think it's a $20 set. I'll have the actual factual price as well as a link to where you can get one down in the description below. I don't have any kind of affiliate anything with Target, so if If you choose to get it through Target, that's fine. I don't necessarily think this set is going to be super great, but I did want to review some big box store sets because they are more accessible. They're what people who are not familiar with watercolor or not familiar with art supplies are going to have the most access to and are going to see the most frequently. And I thought that it would be just very inclusive and kind of covering all my bases to hit watercolors from these kinds of stores. I've also talked about watercolors from Five Below, and last year I talked about watercolors from Dollar Tree, Dollar General, and Five Below. So I do enjoy kind of hitting the gamut of watercolors. Sometimes there's something fun out there, and I'm really interested in accessible art supplies because I want to help you guys find art supplies that'll help y'all make art a habit. So off the bat, I appreciate how simply this is packaged, at least from the outside. We have some beautiful watercolor floral work on the exterior. I would love it if they credited their artist. I've complained about that in the past, and I have heard some good arguments for why not to credit them. I'm still not convinced. I don't think there's anything wrong with putting a little name credit on there. In fact, by tying an artist's name to it, to me, it adds credibility for the brand and the product. And it makes me think that perhaps the art was actually done for Mondo Llama with Mondo Llama products, rather than them maybe purchasing something that they had the rights to use that were made with something completely different. So attaching that creator's name, in my opinion, does add to it. So this is a 24 Halfpan set. We have digital swatch, well, they are digital, but swatches on the back. I find these are not really a great representation of what the colors are going to look like. These are made by Mondo Llama. I believe this is a white labeling company. It includes 24 watercolors. They are 3.4 grams each, which is nice. Normally, companies don't tell me how big their half pans are, and that's not a standardized size. Some brands are smaller than others, so it's nice that they actually give us a size. 2 paintbrushes and a palette. And they also say that this product is made with FSC certified to help protect forests for future generations. So basically, FSC wood is sustainably sourced wood, like from wood farms. My brother and I actually inherited a pine wood farm from our dad. So I know a little bit about that, although we are interested in replanting with native trees in the future, just as a way of giving back to the environment. So sustainably forested wood can be a good thing. In fact, we went out of our way to print 7-inch Cara on sustainably forested wood. So that's actually a cause that's important to me, but it is not why I bought these. I just thought that I would point it out. So I actually can't find a way to just slip the belly band off because it wants to catch on the buckle. But we can just carefully peel this off. I do actually appreciate this packaging. The wood packaging aside, I appreciate the very simple paper packaging. Often with big box stores like Walmart, there's excessive plastic packaging to deter theft. I appreciate that Target and Mondo Llama, because I believe Mondo Llama is a brand that works very closely with Target. It might even be a store brand of theirs, although I think you can get it elsewhere, kind of like Uli used to be. And Yubi used to be. Anyway, I do appreciate that they've taken a more minimal approach with their packaging. So inside it is pretty plain wood, but I like that. It's been lightly wood boxed. Wow. Lightly wood burned, Becca. You could decorate the exterior with the watercolors inside, or you could use Posca markers or alcohol markers or paint markers. So you could actually personalize your set if you wanted to, which might be fun. Given the art on the exterior of the box, I would assume that this palette is meant to appeal to teenage and adult artists, so I'm going to be judging it as a student grade watercolor rather than as a children's grade watercolor. So let's go ahead and open it up. Inside is pretty plain. We have a somewhat flimsy plastic liner that is removable. This looks a lot like the nicer sets online that either feature wells that have like enamel on the inside or have a ceramic plate at the top. And then inside we have our half pans. They're not really held in place by anything. They're just kind of in there. But when it was shut, although they moved around, like they rattled a little bit, they didn't seem to move around significantly. So you just might want to be aware. Can't get it in now that I got it out. You might just want to be aware that these aren't held in by anything, unlike some of the other palettes that we've looked at. And then our two brushes are synthetic. They are very stiff synthetic. We have a small round and we have a medium bright. I will test these later, but I'm not going to actually swatch the watercolors with these. And then we have just a piece of paper to kind of protect one side from the other. So I do want to give Mondo Llama some kudos for the minimal packaging, but one thing I've noticed in the Student Grade Showdown is that with very, very cheap watercolors, they don't feel the need to wrap their Halfpans in anything. With slightly nicer watercolors, or nicer in general up to professional grade watercolors, they often will wrap them in foil or paper just to kind of protect them from, you know, other colors polluting them and to protect them from atmospheric moistures, because good quality watercolors include a humectant, something that, you know, is hydrophilic, will absorb water from the atmosphere. That allows them to absorb the water that you're going to use to watercolor with them and make them a little bit easier to activate. Honey is a very popular humectant gum. Arabic is also, and those can also serve as the binder. With cheaper watercolors, I could not tell you what they're using as the binder, because they're not telling what they're using as the binder. It could be dextrin, it could be glycerin. There's a few very cheap binders that can be used. And as I've noticed during the Student Grade Showdown, with these cheaper sets, they often tend to be dye-based, and the dye has been precipitated onto some kind of substrate. I hate those. I have reviewed so many of those. I really hate them. So this is looking like it might be that kind of a set, but I really hope it isn't that kind of a set. I really hope I'm wrong. I sure have a lot of opinions for somebody you might not have met yet. I'm Becca. I'm a watercolor comic artist and art educator. I teach in person as well as online. And over the past decade, I have reviewed thousands of art supplies, most of which have been purchased out of pocket with either my funds or with funds from my amazing patrons on Patreon. I want to show you guys a little bit of my comic work so that you guys can kind of get an idea of where I'm coming from and what I'm looking for when I'm looking at watercolors. So when I'm painting my comic, I'm typically painting with professional grade watercolors because they just have the kind of properties that I want for the kind of work I'm trying to create. But when I'm teaching, I'm often working with other people's budgets, especially people who are newer to watercolor and might not be ready to make a big commitment. So the Student Grade Showdown is in service to helping them find watercolors that are very affordable, very accessible, but aren't complete and total garbage, because a lot of the stuff out there on the market, the student grade stuff, is horrible. It's such a waste of money, and I can confidently say that because I've reviewed most of it. So let's go take a look at my comic. This is my convention, my sales portfolio with pages from 7-inch Kara. Most of them are from the second volume. I've been working on Kara for about 10 years now, and I have painted hundreds of watercolor comic pages. So over the years, I've really developed some strong opinions about what I like about watercolor and what I don't want to see in watercolor. These are painted on Canson Montval. It is a cellulose watercolor paper that has the right mix of properties for the kind of art that I want to make. But when I'm doing standalone illustrations, I prefer to paint on cotton rag, and I have a few brands that I happen to really like a lot. If you like the look of these pages, you can read them for free as a webcomic at 7inchkara.com, or if you are a fan of my work or a fan of the channel, or you're just a fan of comics, especially all ages comics about tiny 7-inch tall girls making friends with teenage human girls and getting into all kinds of trouble and having all kinds of adventures, if you're just that kind of a nerd, I have volume 1 and volume 2 available in my shop, natosoup.com/shop. I'll have a link down in the description, as well as there'll be some text that pops up here on the screen. And this, see, it's actually lettered. I do most of my work traditionally in watercolor, but I do the lettering digitally. It just allows for easier working with a medium like watercolor. It means I can kind of move my text around. So there's definitely some value into checking it out as an individual thing. And the cool thing about the books is that they have bonus sections with things that aren't online, like the guest art gallery. So it features art that I've commissioned from other artists over the years. And then also a section on my comic process. So if you're interested in making your own comics, if you want to know more about how I make 7-inch Cara, the bonus section in volume 2 has a lot of great resources that'll help you out with that and hopefully inspire you. And then there's also just a lot of beautiful art in it. And volume 1's bonus is not only a bonus comic, but also a concept art section. So if you like what you see, you can head on over to either 7inchcara.com to start reading or to nattosoup.com/shop to order your own copies. And I've got a special deal where you can save a lot of money if you buy volume 1 and volume 2 together. So I really hope you guys will check it out. But you guys can see I do a lot of painting. I do a lot of individual panels on the page. And the main goal of what I'm painting is for reproduction. It's going to be printed in a book. So while I want the colors to look good and to behave well, archival properties, while nice and very important, aren't necessarily the biggest thing in my mind. Like these backgrounds here were done with Brusho, which is notoriously light fugitive. But when I'm working on art to sell, I do want it to stand the test of time because I don't want to sell somebody something that's going to fade in a couple of years. Well, I don't think art should last forever, and I think new artists should have room in the market to express themselves. We shouldn't be competing with Renaissance masters. We shouldn't be competing with Victorian masters. We shouldn't even be competing with artists in the 20s. We should be competing for your attention and for your money, honestly, with our own contemporaries. So while I do want my art to last and I want it to be enjoyed and I want it to be affordable and accessible to people who want to own original watercolor illustrations, I do not care if it lasts 200 years. I have kind of misgivings about the fact that our local museum, NOMA, is primarily art that's older than 200 years painted by old white guys. Just to call it a little bias on my part. I'd like to see more people of color. I'd like to see more female and non-binary voices in there. And I'd like to see some comic pages in there. But that's kind of the viewpoint that I'm coming from when I'm, talking about watercolors and when I'm reviewing watercolors. I'm not a watercolor fine artist. I do not care about that at all. I am a watercolor comic artist and illustrator. And when I talk to people about making comics and they see my comic pages and they want to make their own watercolor comics, and believe me, that happens every time, I want to be able to recommend some watercolors that they can get started with. So that's my bias. Now you guys know a little bit about me. And if you'd like to check out more of my art, I share it on all the socials. Now that you know a little bit about me and you've had a chance to hopefully check out my work, you know what I'm going to be kind of looking for. And we're going to see if these watercolors can offer what I'm looking for in a series of tests. So we're going to start out with swatching. Swatching is going to tell us a lot of information. Then we're going to move on to color mixing because your watercolors should be able to mix and make new colors. And then we're going to do the wet into wet test where I allow the watercolors to dance on the paper and we learn a lot just kind of watching how they move and watching how they interact. That's kind of the prelude to the field test, which if I like these watercolors, there will be a field test and a follow-up video. But if I don't like these watercolors, I'm not going to waste my time or your time with a field test. And then once we've got some information about these watercolors, I will pull some other student grade watercolors from my growing collection, my growing dragons hoard of student grade watercolors. And we'll talk about watercolors that are comparable as well as watercolors that might be a better fit for your money. Because even if I don't like a product, I don't want you guys to walk away discouraged or empty-handed. I want to arm you, enable you with knowledge so that you can buy watercolor supplies with confidence. Our watercolor tests are going to be done on a cotton rag watercolor paper because I want to give these watercolors the best shot at shining, and I feel like doing that on a cotton rag paper is really the fairest way to go. It's going to allow the paints to shine on their own merits, and this is the paper that I use for all of my student grade Showdown. So it's a nice kind of through line, it's a nice basis for comparison, and I use it as the control. Now, it being cotton rag means that these kind of tests do get kind of pricey, so I do want to thank my awesome patrons over on Patreon, patreon.com/NettoSoup, once again for their support, because it is their support that enables me, that allows me to do these kind of reviews that hopefully help a wider public. So if you like what I do and you want to help me continue to do it, and you appreciate the fact that I don't have any outside sponsorships, you guys are not seeing a HelloFresh ad or a Magic Spoon ad, and I'm sure not trying to push a VPN that I know nothing about on you guys can join me at patreon.com/NettoSoup. So we are working on the Blick Premier cotton rag paper. This is a block bound paper, and usually these tests take about, depending on, this one will probably take 2 sheets rather than 3. When I do the 48 sets, it usually takes 3 sheets of paper. We're going to start out with our swatches, and to do that, I want to, this one is getting old. There's only 2 sheets left, so it's basically pulled away from the pad itself, but I want to create a black line that I can use to test opacity. Not only are we going to be looking at the colors in this set, but we're going to be looking at some of the properties the colors have with this. So we're going to be looking at opacity, how the colors wash out with water, granulation, liftability, and I want to see some variety. If these are using real pigments, which there was no pigment information included, there wasn't even color names included with this set. So yeah, this is gonna be fun, but we're still gonna try. We're still gonna look. I am nothing if I am not an art supply completionist, and I did want to do due diligence and cover something from Target. So while the misgivings, the red flags are starting to pop up here and there, I am just going to persist and give you guys as fair a review as possible. So what I want to do is I want to pre-activate these using a spritz of water, and that'll allow the pigments to absorb some water and hopefully lift and move, and we can paint with them. Since I want my reviews to be educational as well as informative, I like to point out things to you guys as I notice them so that you can learn to recognize them as well. And one of the things we're on the lookout for with student grade watercolors is optical brighteners. These are fillers and extenders that are meant to make the half pans look more appealing in their half pan form, to make the colors look brighter and more vibrant, to make the mass tone, which is kind of the color that all the paint piled up together would be, to make that more appealing. With higher quality watercolors, you are not necessarily going to have this beautiful, vibrant half pan palette, because some of those colors are going to be very translucent, and that means their mass tone is going to be darker than the color is actually going to be. So with cheaper watercolors, they will use extenders. They'll use like PW6, which is a white pigment, to not only kind of stretch out the paint and make it cheaper and to make it kind of fill up the half pan faster, but it will also make those half pans look brighter and more enticing. And this kind of falls into something that I call aspirational art, where we have art supplies that look great, but they are horrible to use, or they don't really layer the way they're supposed to, or they don't perform as intended. Now, with these kind of cheaper watercolors, a little bit of optical brighteners isn't necessarily a bad thing. Some of my favorite brands, like the Mei pigments, do utilize some optical brighteners, but I don't want to see it in every half pan, because it makes mixing colors and layering colors a nightmare. It makes your colors turn to mud if every color has it. So you see how when I spritzed it with water, some of the colors got a whole lot brighter, that's usually indicative of optical brighteners. And I'm starting to notice that it is also a thing with watercolors that use dyes rather than pigments. And even nice professional grade watercolors will sometimes use what's known as lake pigments, which are dyes that have been kind of precipitated out onto a substrate. So like madder red or indigo are traditionally lake pigments, but you don't want your entire palette to be that. That's not a great thing. It's a way to cut corners and be very, very cheap. Mondo Llama didn't include a swatch card, so we're just going to dive in on our Blick Studio paper. I'm looking at opacity, how the colors wash out, granulation, and liftability. I pre-activated these and I immediately started to see some lighter patches form, which is pretty indicative of optical brighteners. The mass tone swatches are pretty saturated and there's no major differences in opacity, which is kind of a bad sign with watercolor. When washing these out, the colors basically become all the same color. There's no gradient in the color. I've noticed that a lot of cheaper watercolors do this. We actually want to see more of a gradient in color, and ideally we'd like to see at least some granulation with some of the colors. These definitely seem like dye-based watercolors. The yellow ochre is just so wrong for a yellow ochre. It's like a very cheap gold. This set has very few neutrals, and the ones it does have don't have the granulation that earth pigments typically would. Earth pigments are very cheap, so to sub out earth pigments is very concerning. These aren't dry yet, and I already have a lot to say about them. So first off, you can tell some of these are going to be big offenders when the neutrals are weird. And what do I mean by the neutrals are weird? I mean, yellow ochre is made with a very cheap pigment traditionally, and it has kind of a specific look. And I have noticed that with cheap watercolors, it also has a very specific look, just totally different from what it's supposed to look like. And it should have some opacity to it because it is an earth pigment. Look, that thing is clear. And some of the other neutrals are also just big old red flags flashing there, just woo, woo, woo. And the inclusion of a gray is just very why, because this isn't like some companies do include like Payne's gray or gray of gray, like specialty grays, Davies gray, Dove gray, Jane's gray. This is none of those grays. This is just black mixed with white. And look, it has no opacity to it. It has no oomph. If you want a no opacity gray, just water down your black. Bang, you got it. These are concerning. They are, I think, maybe with the exclusion of the vertiver blue, that one might be okay, but these seem like dye-based watercolors. Yes, they are very bright, they are very appealing, but I have a lot of experience with these kind of watercolors, and take my word for it, they just, as soon as you start adding in water, they fall apart. Speaking of, we should be seeing gradiated washes. You guys saw I did half a swatch and then added water. Usually you'd start to see with nicer quality watercolors, the colors start to intermingle, and it wouldn't be like a perfect gradient, but you would see some gradation and you would see some granulation with some of the colors. Look how flat everything looks. There is no, with the exception of the vertiver blue there is no real granulation. There's no real gradation. It just kind of morphs out. And that's one of the things I don't like about dye-based watercolors is wet into wet techniques do not work well. But we're going to see that when we do the wet into wet test. And another concern, again, going back to the granulation, is like, other than this one, our one exception, no granulation here. This should have some granulation. This should have some granulation. Some of these blues should have some granulation. This green should have some granulation. Some of the yellows should have some granulation. That yellow ochre should definitely have some granulation. None. It's just very flat. It's kind of boring. Now, while swatching these, I had a thought, perhaps a dangerous thought. So those of you who watch what I do, you know I don't do this kind of art. But I thought, not for any reason, I just don't. I think it's pretty, it's just not something that I'm good at that I do. But I was thinking that perhaps for today's unboxing swatch, I should attempt some simple brushwork florals and see if maybe I'm just missing something. Maybe I've just been using all these dye-based cheapo watercolors wrong. Maybe this is what I will love. Maybe it'll look like this. I mean, minus, my inability to do that, maybe it'll look like that. So I think probably after the wet into wet test, I'll try to do some loose brushwork florals. I'm just going to look up some, like a bouquet or something online. I'm not going to try to recreate what they've got on their packaging. And I feel like that should be a really fair test for these because it's on the actual packaging. That's what they want you to use it for, right? But usually when I do these reviews and I get these kind of dye-based watercolors that have a lot of very saturated colors that activate quickly, usually I would say, well, these might be good for brush calligraphers. These might be good for people who do brushwork florals. These might be good for card makers who want high color impact but aren't looking to build up a lot of layers. And I've never really put that so much to the test. I think with a couple of them, I've done a little bit of very bad brush calligraphy just to see how the colors blend and just to see how well they work with the brushes. But I've never really put my money where my mouth is. So I think for today's review, I'll try it. I'll try something new. It might be terrible looking. You guys will just have to bear with me. So look forward to that. If you're just jumping into my student grade showdown, you might think I rail on dye-based watercolors a lot, maybe excessively. I've encountered so many cheapo dye-based watercolors that are cheaper than their price point, and I've also encountered a few really great inexpensive student grade watercolors. So I get kind of frustrated because the dye-based watercolors are just very, very boring to review. They all perform basically the same way. They all have some of the same limitations. They're just very boring, and I've been seeing a lot of them. And I also see them as kind of a cop-out. These companies are purchasing these watercolors from a manufacturer. It might be the same manufacturer, but I actually think it's probably like 3 different manufacturers, and they're white labeling them as their own product. And while there isn't necessarily anything super wrong with white labeling a good product as your own, if you're not going to make watercolors and you're not going to source a good manufacturer and you can't find it at your price point, then maybe just don't make watercolors instead of making watercolors that are not great. But I just wanted to kind of like acknowledge that bias and acknowledge that frustration. These dye-based cheapo watercolors are going to be, they're killing the student grade showdown for me. I'm encountering them so frequently, they just make it not fun anymore. So if you hear some frustration, that is why. I kind of figured these might be that. That's why I front loaded it with caveats at the beginning. So this is probably going to turn into one of those reviews where you just watch it to laugh at my pain rather than because you're genuinely curious if the Mondo Llama watercolors are for you. But I promise I'm not going to get too snarky, at least not snarky without good reason. So let's let these dry and come back and do the lift test. So all seem to have similar liftability, which is not a good sign, except for the vetiver bluish color kind of towards the bottom there. You want to see some variation in how watercolors lift because different pigments and different particle sizes are going to have different staining properties. So when they all tend to lift the same, that's not the best sign of quality. If you look closely, you'll see that all of these colors lift about the same. The only exception is the vetiver blue, which lifts more. And this is not something you want to see because watercolors that utilize different pigments are going to have different lifting and different staining properties. For everything to be about the same is definitely kind of concerning. And it still kind of leads into these might be dye-based. Now, the substrate they use can make a difference as to how lifting they're going to be. Something that's dye-based is going to be very staining, and the substrate might affect that somewhat and make it more liftable. It really kind of just depends. So we're going to move on next to the color mixing test and hopefully learn more about these watercolors. And since I still have space on my page, I'm just going to do that in the marginalia. For the color mixing test, we're going to do two different types of color mixing. We're going to do atomic color mixing, where we take two half pans of color, we take two different colors and smash them together to make a secondary color. And then we're going to do optical mixing, where we do a glaze of one color, let it dry, and then do a glaze of the second color. And these two different types of color mixing should hopefully tell us a lot about the watercolors we're dealing with today. Given that this is only a 24 color set, it was pretty easy to find my base mixing colors, my cool yellow, cool red, warm red, cool blue, and warm blue. But none of these colors have a whole lot of impact, especially that ultramarine blue. That ultramarine blue is very weak and milky. And on that note, these watercolors produce really weak, desaturated, chalky color mixes. These fall apart as soon as you add water. So this is not going to be a good set if you want to do color mixing basically at all. You guys can see how weak and desaturated these mixes are here without them even drying. Usually when colors are wet, that's when they're most saturated and they're most vibrant, and these are really very unimpressive. The optical mixes, while functional, are pretty unimpressive because the base colors themselves are pretty unimpressive. The mixes these create are just really weak, kind of desaturated, they kind of fall apart. Even with really bright saturated colors like the oranges, they're just kind of a shade of what we would hope to see by mixing two really bright colors together. So that tells me this set is not gonna be good if you enjoy doing color mixing, you wanna mix your own skin tones, you wanna mix your own tints. This set is not going to be useful for that. And honestly, color mixing is a big part of being a student in watercolor and learning how to use your tools. And if the watercolors don't mix well, then they're probably not a good fit for you and your learning needs. Little plastic mixing palette is actually kind of challenging to clean out. I recommend running it under water to clean it out well. Let's go ahead and move on to the wet into wet test. I have a fresh cup of clean filtered water and we have a fresh pad of Blick Studio Cotton Rag paper. Again, thank you to my patrons. They make things like this possible. So what we're going to do is we are going to saturate our pad of paper, and then we're just going to start playing with the watercolors wet into wet, see how they diffuse and see what they do. The wet into wet test can reveal a lot of problems, particularly with cheaper watercolors, but it's a test I'm really glad to do because it helps me avoid some of the worst watercolors. At least I don't like field test them. And this, I kind of learned doing the Mia field test. It was just so disappointing. Sometimes colors swatch well, but as soon as you add water, they just fall apart. And speaking of, these are really, really weak. The only color that granulates is the vetiver blue. These colors just fall apart when you add water. They're not really good, at least compared to other comparably priced brands. They're just not really good for this kind of work. Basically, if you don't have access to other watercolors, whether you can't shop online or you can't go to other stores, this set might be okay, but there are better options out there at around the $20 price point, and we're definitely going to talk about that. In water, these basically fall apart. The only colors that really kept any of their former selves are some of the yellows, one of the reds, the Vertiver Blue and kind of the Opera Rose, but basically everything else that I put in this, and in some instances I went over it several times to really try to saturate it, it just fell apart. The Vertiver Blue, we do actually see some granulation, which is kind of nice, but it makes me wonder, why is that half pan different from the other ones? Why did they change the formulation or go with something different? I could not even tell you guys, but I will say that I'm not really that impressed with this set. I do like the all wood packaging. I've already stained it in a few places, but that's not really a deal killer. And what I will probably do is this will probably be a set I end up gutting if I don't just end up rehoming it outright. I'm kind of on the fence about that because, oh man, I don't like passing bad news along to other people. If I'm going to rehome a set, I'd rather the people either know what they're getting into when they get it, or it be a good set that I would actually stand behind. So I have one more test I want to do. I want to try painting some of those loose watercolor florals using this set and see if we can even do that. Although, honestly, I have my doubts. This is a reminder that I do not know what I'm doing. This is not something that I do often, so this is not a tutorial by any shakes. I just wanted to see how feasible it would be to use these watercolors to try to recreate florals similar to this, or if it just totally falls apart, because I'm going by the packaging as like a suggested use case or a possible audience, since they're using the imagery with the watercolors. I feel like that's very intentional, so I figured it's worth a shot. Admittedly, my watercolor florals look like crap. This is not something I'm particularly good at, but I did notice a few things. Yeah, you kind of can do it and you will get some wet into wet blends, but since these are dye-based, the colors want to fill the area, so you don't get those really soft transitions. So like a lot of the wet into wet and gentle blended transitions aren't really going to work with these, just given how they're formulated. If you're a watercolor floral artist and you've used these and you like them, please do show me your work, because I'd like to see an example of how these might be handled well, because obviously I'm terrible at this, but I did want to try some of the techniques that I know are pretty common, the very loose wet into wet brushwork, and you guys can just see how the watercolors are just flooding the entire area. If there's water there, they're going to fill the hole, and that is not useful when it comes to brushwork florals. This isn't even dry and it looks absolutely horrible, but I feel like if you know what you're doing with brush florals, if you know the brush strokes you're supposed to use, if you've got kind of a good hand for it, these might work okay. They certainly look good while they're still wet. So if you're just doing it for like an Instagram photo, or you're just doing it for like a YouTube short, you could definitely get away with these. But as you guys can see, they do dry a lot duller. And one of the problems I have with them is you don't really get that like soft blend out gradation of color into white. It basically, all the color just immediately seeps into there. So I do feel like you could do it to some extent, but because these are dye based, the colors move a whole lot more than you would expect with more professional grade watercolors. So I do think you could use this for brush florals. I do also think you could probably use this for calligraphy if you're not intending to sell it, if it's just for demonstration purposes or just for practice purposes, but I don't think they're going to handle the way nicer watercolors would probably handle in this instance. So there's like a big caveat there of like, yeah, you could and it'll probably work out okay, but. So Mondo Llama seems to be an art and craft brand primarily through Target, and they do make kind of a wide array of stuff, but it's all kind of aimed more at the beginner level. So they make stuff for kids and they make stuff aimed at adults, but all of it is kind of like introductory art supplies. They sell everything from unfinished wood painting kits to wax resist like coloring sheets, which is a really neat idea that I might have to play around with myself, to watercolor brushes and watercolors. And they do actually have a set of watercolor brushes that these look like they come from for about $10. There's a few more in there, but these are very stiff for watercolor brushes. This particular set is $20 on Target, and I'm laughing because it's got 4.5 positive stars. Like, it's got 32 ratings and the average is 4.5 stars, and I'm over here like, what? This is also a Target exclusive, which isn't really surprising to anybody. 75% of the ratings are 5 stars, and only 3% are 1 star, and another 3% are 2 stars. So I guess I should say where I would put this is like around 3 or lower stars, and that's only 12% of the ratings. 90% would recommend this set, which again is just kind of boggling to me. Mostly though, the positive reviews focus on the set itself being very cute, or that their kids enjoy the set, or that they enjoy using these with their kids. So with that in mind, it's not a bad set. I do think $20 is a little bit high for a watercolor set that you're using with kids. I believe Yarka has some good, in fact, I've talked about Yarka here on the channel, and I have even done a field test with Yarka watercolors, and I was pretty impressed with what I saw. But they have a children's grade that I would say perform more like we would expect watercolors to perform. That might be a better fit for you and your kids if you're looking for kid-friendly watercolors. Given the fact that there's not a lot of information available about these, they're very focused on the fact that these are FSC certified and they are supposedly non-toxic. But other than that, there isn't a lot of information about these, about their makeup, about the materials that are going into them. And I would just be hesitant to buy these to use with a kid if I didn't know what was in them. But when I say kid, I also am thinking younger children, not necessarily teenagers. So kids who might end up getting it on their hands or on their arms, I wouldn't necessarily get this set for them just because Mondo Llama isn't particularly forthcoming about what's in this set. Now, since the site does make some claims, I thought it'd be good to kind of check in and see how well they meet them. So it promises 24 color watercolor paint set kit sets you up to start painting. Sure, we do get 24 Halfpans. Vibrant hues blend to create the colors you want. No. Includes paints, 2 brushes, and a palette. I mean, I guess you could call this a palette. It's very cheap. Conforms to ASTM D4236 and is non-toxic, sure. And Forest Stewardship Council certified, which really just comes from the fact that it's in a wood box. According to the Target corporate site, Mondo Llama was launched in 2021, and it's an arts and crafts brand designed to inspire kids and adults alike to cultivate their creativity. The brand features everything from paint sets and canvases to craft supplies and drawing kits, all in a colorful, bold palette. And I do believe it is a Target brand. In fact, it is listed under Target brand. So yeah, it's a Target brand. So we've put these Mondo Llama watercolors through several tests, and I was not super impressed with them. So now I want to talk about some comparable watercolors and then some watercolors I think you guys might like better. And this is definitely a prices are going to vary. We're dealing with inflation. What you paid for something in July might not be what you pay for it in July the next year. So I'm trying to find comparable things, but just keep in mind they may be a few dollars more or less than the $20 price point we're looking at. So $20 is kind of hard to beat, which means we see a lot of bad art supplies sold at the $20 price point. But generally, if it's this many colors or more and they only want around $20 for it, it's going to be dye-based and your mileage may vary. So these kind of reminded me of the See Me Art watercolors that I reviewed kind of early on in this Showdown. It has a metal box, but it has the same kind of clasp. This is the 96 color set, and I really did not like it. I found the colors to be kind of uninspired. I found that you really had to scrub to activate the color. It was really difficult to pick up the colors in this set. So on that case, the Mondo Llama set wins. That was a way easier set to use than this set. It also kind of reminded me of the nicer of the two Giorgione sets that I reviewed. This is their 48 color set. This is a very budget watercolor set, but they were kind of similar. They handled kind of along the same way. And I will insert clips from each of these reviews for those of you who are short on time, just to kind of give you guys an idea of what I'm talking about. But if any of these look interesting or intriguing to you, or if you're just like me and you go down these weird rabbit holes where you watch everything in a subject until you've totally oversaturated yourself, I will link the reviews in the description as well to make it easy for you guys to find. These also, horribly so, remind me of these Diane W watercolors. And by the way, I didn't grab all of the weird dye-based watercolors I've reviewed recently because it would take up this whole table. I really tried to just grab the ones that really remind me of this set. Ooh, these don't want to come out. I may have to pause the video. All right, so that is the Diane W set. I'm sure I'm saying it wrong. And I did a little bit of loose brush work with this set on the paper that they so generously included. It really feels more like filler paper than paper you might want to watercolor on, but kind of similar feelings to the Mondo Llama set. In fact, now that I have them both open, just in terms of the colors and how they look in the Halfpans, they look very similar to me. So it could be that they are getting their watercolors from the same supplier, since I do think Mondo Llama is an OEM company and they just white label everything. They may be getting them from the same supplier, and in which case I think this set is about $20 too. So while I cannot and will not and do not recommend either of these two sets, you do get 48 colors with this one and you only get 24 with that one. And then here is another example of the See art. Some of these just, they get stuck in their packaging and then they don't want to come out. And I'm keeping the packaging until the end of the student grade showdown because the packaging is often part of the product and part of the review. And it's handy to have it to show you guys because otherwise everything starts looking generic. Actually, while I'm thinking about it, thinking of and speaking of generic, so this is the See art watercolor set. This is their pastel set. It's nowhere near as good as the Prima Marketing Pastel Dreams, which is just a rebrand of Mungyo watercolors. These are very dye-based. They're not much fun in my opinion. They're cute. They're very aesthetic, but they're not really fun as watercolors. So this is the Meeden watercolors that I reviewed recently. And these are also very, very similar to the Mondo Llama. Both sets are a little more saturated than what I normally see with these kind of dye-based cheap watercolors, but they handle very similarly to one another. So this might be another one. I know Meeden is also a white label brand, so they may be buying these from the same manufacturers, although the Halfpans on the Mondo Llama set look a little bit smaller than the Halfpans here, and that does make a difference because if they're just buying something in bulk and repackaging it, it would start to look the same. So they may just be using the same kind of formula or similar formula, but this is another very cheap budget set that uses dyes to get the color in the watercolors. If you're looking for bright, saturated color, this might be a better set for that. I still don't really like this set, and I'm not recommending it, but it might be better. And then we have one of the worst dye-based sets I've reviewed, the Xylee W set. It looks a lot like the Faber-Castell watercolors that I'd actually like to review because those are made using India inks, and I think that's very intriguing, and it starts falling in line with like kind of the Inktense, and I want to see how they compare to Inktense. I just haven't purchased those yet, but these are horrible. They are so bad. They're about as bad as the first See art set. I really, really don't like them, and I cannot recommend them. And I hope you guys will not spend your money on those and buy something you'll be a lot happier with. So what about the good? What about some sets that are around-ish the $20 price point and will make you happier. So the Sakura Koi watercolors are admittedly more than $20. They can actually be kind of expensive for what they are. They do come in different sizes, and while I don't use these anymore, I used to use them all the time when I was working as a convention artist doing quick fire commissions, because I like the price point. They handle reliably. Of some of the cheaper student grade watercolors, I think these are still really very good, and they handle more like regular watercolors than like cheap watercolors. So this is a set that I happen to like and would recommend over the Mondo Llama set. And I have gone through like 5 or 6. I used to buy the little 12 sets, and I went through a bunch of those. And then I started buying the 36 color sets, and I went through a bunch of those too. So I have used a lot of Sakura Koi watercolors over the years. Another set I think is better than the Mondo Llama set that I think you guys might like better, but this one's cheaper. This is closer to the $20 price point, is the Montmartre watercolor set. And it says it's 21 pieces, but I think 18, there's 18 colors, and then they count this as a piece, and the sponge as a piece, and the water brush as a piece. But I was really impressed with this set for what it is and for its price point and its size. And this is going to be one of the sets that actually move on to the field test round, so I can really decide if it's something that I want to recommend. I don't have any affiliation with any of these brands at all. All of these opinions are based on the reviews that I've done and my experiences as a watercolor artist, but honestly, when I recommend something to you guys, I feel like I'm putting my own good name at stake. So I try to be careful about not wholeheartedly endorsing or recommending something that I don't actually believe in, because I want you guys to be able to trust me when I say something is good, just like I want you guys to be able to trust me when I say something is bad. But this one has potential, and I do definitely think it's better than the Mondo Llama set. Even though we don't get quite as many colors, we get 18 pans. That's not bad. That's only 6 fewer than this. And I think, I mean, they do waste space with a white. I do think adding a white is always a waste of space. And these are a little bit smaller, but they handle a lot better, and they handle more like what you would want watercolors to handle like. Then we get to move into the ones that I can actually endorse, because I have done field tests with them, or they're basically the same set, and I really like them, and I trust that they will do what I say they're going to be doing. And that would be the Shanghai Aowen Mei-Liang pigments and the Shanghai Aowen watercolors. These are both made by the same manufacturer. They are both kind of in the student grade lineup, but they are better student grade watercolors than a lot of what we've talked about. And these kind of always hover around $20. Like, I've seen this set go for $24. I've seen this set go for $16. It really, really depends on just where Amazon's at that day. So if you are on a budget and you have time to wait, you can either use Honey or Camel and set an alert to let you know when these are at a historic low, and that's when you can buy. This is a 36 color set, and I paid a lot. I paid more than what it goes for because I bought it from a local art supply store, but this set does sometimes go for under $20. I believe they also have a 24-piece set, which is less common to see, and a 48-piece set, which is also less common to see. But I really like this set. I have used it for a variety of watercolor illustrations. I have several friends who have also used this set, and they use it with their kiddos under supervision, and their kids like this set as well. So since the Mondo Llama set is talking about, like, a lot of the reviews were parents talking about how much they like the set because they could use it with their kids, this is going to be a better set in my, I've used it, I like it, I recommend it. You do see some granulation, you do see when you wash out the color, it doesn't just rush to fill in that water. You do get like an actual gradient going on. These handle a lot more like regular watercolor. And the Aowens are very similar. The big difference is we get these very cute square half pans, and otherwise they swatched almost identical to the Mei-Liang. So I really think it's just a format difference. So whichever of these two work better for you, that would be what I recommend. But these are the sets that are around-ish $20. I did include the koi set, which is more, but you can find the koi set at Michael's. So I did want to include an option that you could easily find at a big box store, that I know you can find at a big box store. I got the Montmartre and I got the Montmartre on Amazon. I got the yellow Aowen on AliExpress, and I bought my Malayang pigments at my favorite art supply store, David's Art Supply David's Art Center in Metairie, Louisiana. So, you know, sometimes it's worth it to just Google art supply stores in my area and head on down and just talk to the people who work there and see what they recommend. So what are the pros and cons of the Mondo Llama watercolor set? And as with sets that I don't like, I'm going to start with the pros. So the fact that you can, and I haven't always seen this at Target, like when I went and lived in Nashville, I actually went looking for it and I couldn't find it. But a lot of people do see it in person at their Target. So theoretically, you could just go to Target and pick it up in person. And this is helpful because honestly, not everybody lives near an art supply store. In fact, there's only one art supply store in my area. I don't really count Michael's or Hobby Lobby for various reasons. So accessibility is really important. And if you're not an artist, you may feel kind of intimidated going into an art supply store. I know there's kind of like a stereotype of pretension, but I do have to say, at least at David's, everyone there is super nice and very approachable, and they really just want to help you find art supplies that you're gonna like. And they're not trying to upsell you to something that you can't afford just because they can get away with it. And honestly, in Nashville, we had a Plaza and we had a Jerry's Artorama, and I would say the same was true for both of those places. Now, sometimes the people who work there might not know everything about the particular medium that you're interested in, but that's natural. I don't know anything about oil painting. I could not tell you what brand's a good brand. I couldn't tell you what kind of brushes to get, but I can tell you a lot about watercolor, and it's probably pretty safe to assume that art supply stores hire people who have specialties but aren't, don't know everything about everything all the time, always. So don't be afraid to go in and ask for help and ask some questions, or, do a little bit of Googling and read up. But I do think it is a pro that these are sold at a big box store, that they are accessible. And $20 is not a bad price point at all for watercolors. $20 is very, in fact, kind of like too good to be true, too cheap to expect much of it. But it does make it accessible to people who might not want to work with children's watercolors. They might not like Crayola. They might not know that the Yarka children's watercolors are actually really pretty good. They might have trouble finding those. So I do like that these are accessible and that these might encourage people to try to make art, to get started with art. People who might not have had a chance to do so before, or they're not sure what they like, or they're not sure what to buy. This is kind of an easy introduction to that. Of course, all of that comes with major caveats, because a lot of what I do here on the channel is aimed at helping people who are newer to art, whether you're young or older and you're just starting out on your artistic journey. I really want to help you guys find art supplies that you'll love, that aren't going to be a waste of your money. And that's why things like this really end up ticking me off, because they're not good. It's not as bad as some of the stuff I've reviewed. I've reviewed some real stinkers, but they're not good. And it really makes me wonder, if you're not going to do something well, at least make an effort. If you're not going to show up and do something decent, why show up at all? Why try to fill a hole in a market with a product that's not very good, that's going to have a chance of really turning people off to an amazing art form that has so much variety, so much vitality? So that's kind of my con with these kind of sets, is they don't really perform like good student grade watercolors. They don't really perform like watercolors, at least not like half-pan watercolors. They kind of are like a weird hybrid between liquid dye-based watercolors, like the Radiant watercolors, and half-pan watercolors, and I'm not sure how I feel about it, but I do know that it's not for me. It's something that I can't recommend. I wouldn't recommend it to my students. So to me, that's definitely a big con, is we've got a little bit of like wolf in sheep's clothing going on here. That said, I do like the wooden box. I am going to gut it for the wooden box. And I'm sorry, I'm so bad. I didn't even try out their brushes, but these are really stiff synthetic brushes that are not really great for watercolor. They don't hold a lot of water. They don't hold a lot of pigment. They're more likely to scrape your watercolors off the paper than to really function well as watercolor brushes. I do like that they included 2 brushes in this set. Generally, companies would include a cheap plastic water brush. In fact, I have one here from another review, and if you have one, you could very easily put it in this palette. I do kind of like the palette, to be real. Do I think it's worth 20 bucks? No. Am I going to still use it? Yes. Do I like the plastic liner? No. This thing is so janky and cheap. Am I going to try to replace it with something? Yes. So you could like it with some gutting and modifications, but I do like that they included 2 brushes rather than, say, a water brush. Just because I always like when watercolor kits include brushes, even if they're not very good brushes, because it means you can get started painting sooner rather than later. But if you get these brushes, I recommend you buy the Zen watercolor brushes that they sell at Michael's. And I mean the watercolor. I don't mean the acrylic. I don't mean the mixed media. I mean the watercolor brushes are actually pretty decent. I recommended one of my libraries get them in a few different sizes because they're very affordable. And their big brush is great. So, you know, you may end up heading over to Michael's anyway, because I don't think Target's watercolor brushes are particularly good, at least not from what I've seen from Target over the years. So, like, it's weird. It's like a pro-con. They included brushes, but they're not very good brushes. And my big complaint with this is always, if you don't know what you're getting into, then you might assume that you're the reason your art isn't improving, or your watercolor isn't doing what you see online, what you see other people are able to do in tutorials. And that's something I've seen face first. I've seen head on in a lot of my classes with a lot of my teenage students, is that they're watching TikTok or YouTube and the artist doesn't necessarily talk about the paints that they're using. So they try to recreate the techniques they're seeing with what they have on hand, and they're unable to. And they don't understand why. They figure it must be something wrong with them. And I remember feeling that way myself. So that's why I'm really harsh about these kinds of things, is because I feel like it can be a little bit deceptive if you're newer to the medium, and I frankly just want people to love watercolor and to have a positive experience with watercolor and to find joy in painting and to be able to paint the kind of things they want to be able to paint and to be able to learn how to do the kind of techniques they want to learn how to do. And these are not going to be capable of many common watercolor techniques. So that's another big con. What's my verdict for the Mondo Llama 24-piece $20 watercolor set? Personally, I would recommend you skip this set. A lot of the big box store brand sets are just not very good. The Artist Loft watercolor set is just a rebrand of the Pabio watercolors, and it's pretty terrible. And this Mondo Llama set isn't really doing a whole lot to make me reconsider. And Walmart can be very hit or miss. I reviewed the Simply watercolors from Walmart years ago and absolutely loathed them, but they are currently selling a rebrand of the Superior folding palette, and I went looking for it earlier and I can't find it, but I have it somewhere around the house, and that's going to be an upcoming review, and that should be good. I've reviewed the folding palette in the past and I really liked it. This is just a smaller version of that so that we have something to represent Walmart, and I think it's in like the $9.99 range. So if it is good, you guys will most certainly hear about it, because I will be very excited to tell you about that. Or if it's bad, you'll hear that too, because I'll still be very excited to tell you about it. But I can't really recommend this set. If you are on a budget and you would like to get into watercolor, I highly recommend you check out the Mei Liang pigment set that I talked about earlier, and check out, honestly, the best way to save money when it comes to watercolor is to do your research and go in prepared and have a very lean list. So sometimes that means spending more on something that you can get a lot more use out of. And even with these cheaper pans, I'm starting to see big divots in them. I had trouble getting the water or the color up and moving. I feel like you would work your way through these pans much quicker than with something that doesn't have as many extenders in it, that's going to have more color payoff and more color impact and is just going to handle better. So we talk a lot on this channel about false economy and penny wise, pound foolishness, where you're on such a budget and you really want to save money that you buy the cheapest thing even if you end up regretting it. And with watercolors, sometimes spending a little bit more money can bring you a whole lot more happiness. So the best way to save money when it comes to watercolor is to do your research, to see what other artists are using, and to take recommendations seriously. And if you're ever looking for budget recommendations, if you're ever looking for, like, let's say you have $100 that you can spend on watercolor and you want to get as many good supplies as possible, or 50 or 25, feel free to reach out to me on Discord. I'll put a link to my Discord server, The Paint Box. I would be more than happy to help you out, whether it's for you or a gift. I really want to help you guys find art supplies that are going to make you happy and help your heart sing. So what do you guys think? Are these worth the $20 we spent, or do you think they're a bust? I definitely think they're a bust. They are yet another dye-based, inexpensive watercolor that isn't worth the packaging they've been put in. I don't really know why all these companies feel like they have to offer some kind of watercolor when they could just not. It feels like such a cash grab. But you guys, let me know if you feel differently. Do you love these watercolors? Do you have experience with these watercolors? The reviews are mostly parents who are happy to have a watercolor set that they can share with their child and that their child enjoys. And it really makes me want to just like reach through the computer screen and hand them the Mei Yang pigment set and say, try these. But you know, maybe I'm just too jaded. Maybe I've been doing this too long. Maybe I have too much experience and I've lost the ability to appreciate the simple things. So let me know if you feel differently about these watercolors. So this is a 24 watercolor set. They kind of float around loose in the box. I'm going to be gutting this set and reusing the box for other watercolors later on. They come with 2 synthetic watercolor brushes. These are some stiffer synthetic brushes, so if you do get this set, I would recommend picking up a few softer watercolor brushes if you can. We talked about the Zen watercolor brushes earlier. I think those will be a better fit. I have my swatches here. You guys can see what we're looking at. I tried my hand at some loose watercolor florals, and to be real, they would have been bad anyway, but I think the fact that these are dye-based watercolors and the fact that the color immediately flows, if you add water to it, the color is going to immediately flow. It doesn't matter whether the area that you put the color down in was wetter than the area where you're applying water. I know that doesn't make sense, but watercolor people will know what I'm talking about. It doesn't matter if the reverse is true. There isn't any kind of subtle inflow. It's just very immediate. It kind of lacks any real nuance. So while these wouldn't have been great, they are even worse thanks to these watercolors. And all of this is done on cotton rag paper, so I am giving these watercolors the fairest chance I know. Maybe these are a weird dark horse, these kind of dye-based watercolors. Maybe they do better on cheaper cellulose papers. Let me know if you have experience with them and if you have a way of like wielding them to your weirding ways. The wet into wet test revealed very little granulation. The only color that kind of granulates is the vetiver blue that you guys see here. I have no idea why that's the only one that granulates. Why is that one the different one? I would have loved to have seen some more granulation, but these are dye-based watercolors, so that's really just not in their ability. They're not going to be able to deliver that. Now, I have to say a lot of my bias comes from the fact that I have been reviewing a lot of inexpensive to downright cheap, and by cheap I mean in how they're manufactured, watercolors during the student grade showdown. So I have seen a lot of dye-based watercolors, and they're just very one note. They're very boring in my opinion. They're kind of ubiquitous among the cheaper watercolors, so they're pretty easy to stumble upon, and I don't necessarily feel they really encapsulate what watercolor does so well. They sure are water activated, but I feel like I could get similar techniques with watercolor markers or maybe even Crayola markers in some instances. I have some videos here on the channel about how you can use Crayola super tips as watercolor markers, and they just have kind of the same sort of vibe as that. Very one note, not really inspiring for me, not really interesting. But I will say that when you use the colors just straight up from the Halfpan, you do get some very saturated color. So these might be good for like brush calligraphy or working very saturated one and done. But as soon as you start mixing the colors together, they fall apart. And as soon as you add water, they start to fall apart. So for me as a watercolor comic artist, I just can't recommend these. And as somebody who teaches watercolor, I would only utilize these in a class as kind of like the antithetical, as kind of like, this is what I would recommend you avoid. But I think if you're determined enough, you can use them. I just can't recommend them. Are they worth your $20? Well, considering the Mozart Como Rebi set, which I didn't show and I should have, I just didn't grab it, is around $25, and you get 40 colors and it performs a lot better, and you get whole pans rather than half pans, and it's in a metal tin. I'd recommend that over this. Or considering the Mei Liang Pigments 36-piece set has dipped below 20 on a number of occasions, not always, but if you watch Amazon, you'll see. It makes it really difficult to recommend this set unless you just, I mean, I can't recommend it, period. But the use case I could see is you have a Target in your town and you do not buy things online at all. Those are the two use cases I can see. So I was pretty disappointed with this set. While I didn't have the highest hopes, I figured this was a white label product, and it probably is. I was hoping they were white labeling from maybe like Mungyo or Superior, but you know, that would have just been too much to expect, too expensive to expect from the Mondo Llama watercolors, because after all, Target does need to make a product, and that's the whole point of these store brands, is that you can produce them for less and save all that, or keep all that money, rather than buying it from another company. So thank you guys so much for hanging out with me today. I hope today's review was helpful, useful, and informative. If you like what I do, please remember to leave me a big old thumbs up. And if you're new here and you'd like to see more, whether you like my vibe or you like my art or you enjoy the company or you appreciate the reviews, please consider subscribing and hitting that bell notification so that YouTube will let you know when I have an update. If you're not into that for whatever reason, honestly, YouTube doesn't even notify me when a lot of the creators I like go, so I don't trust YouTube to do that. They're real weird about it. They'll notify me about like creators I've watched like one time, but then not notify me about people I watch all the time, unless I recently watched one of their videos, which if they went on hiatus. So if you don't want to trust YouTube to do that for whatever reason, I do share a weekly Patreon newsletter up on my Patreon. It's set to public, but you do need a Patreon account to be able to follow it and get those updates, and it's not going to cost you anything. And I link everything that went live that week, including my favorite shorts, and often sneak peeks at what I'm working on, as well as sometimes blog posts just talking about things that are going on in life, or talking about a product I recently reviewed, or just my thoughts in general about making art or making comics or art supplies. So if that sounds good to you, you can join me at patreon.com/nattasoup. And if you're feeling generous, if you want to support the work that I'm doing here on YouTube, I do use the funds from my Patreon to buy the supplies that I review, including today's Mondo Llama set. So sometimes that results in a lot of wasted money when we're reviewing a lot of really bad watercolors that I don't even feel good about donating because they're so terrible. But it is made possible thanks to my amazing patrons on Patreon. They allow me to look at the good, the bad, and the crafty of art supplies so that I can save you money. So hopefully I saved you $20 today, and hopefully I'll see you guys again really soon with another tutorial or art supply review. Bye guys!